Good evening. It's 8 o'clock and all is well. Let's get started. All that wonderful African music, Professor Howard told us that all African gatherings start with dancing, and therefore we gave you some music. Instead of dancing, I'm now going to give you a couple of announcents, which I'm sure you'll appreciate even more. The first one is that the Serge Suarez has made DVDs of all these lectures in the series. They will be in the Princeton Public Library and the Mercer County Public Library, the one on Route 1 and Dara Lane. They'll probably be there a couple of weeks after we're finished. So you can go there if you missed any and just check them out of the library as if they were books. For example, the St. Petersburg that I had to miss that I hear is wonderful, I'll get out of the library. Second is that he also is putting them on, they're going to be available online. And this is the address, videos.princetontv.org. I not only wrote it too small the first time, but I wrote it wrong. It is princetontv.org. And he said probably in a couple of weeks, this series will be on there. Right now, the fall of this year and spring of last year are there. So if you missed any of those or want to pick up on some of those globalization and the science series, they're both there. You click on there and then there's a Princeton Adult School that you click on. They have room for lots more things, but we're first in line, and they're glad to have us on there before it gets too busy. The third thing I want to mention, this will not be as much as I had hoped I could tell you, but several of you asked about the series coming up in the fall, and your lecture committee is hard at work. We have chosen the theme, and it's going to be a lecture on the history of science, with touching on lots of different aspects of that. You may know Princeton has a very strong program in the history of science and from lots of departments and things, and so we're working with some of those fine people, and that's what the series will be. It will start probably, I haven't got a calendar with me, but if the second Tuesday in October is October 10th, I think, something like that. Anyway, it'll be the second, the adult school classes begin the first week in October, and we always skip that one and begin the lecture series the following week. So put that on your calendar, and it'll be probably 7 or so lectures following that on Tuesday night. Now I'm going to turn this over to Barbara and let her introduce tonight's speaker. I don't think Barbara's going to dance either. I promise.
Thank you, Nancy. Can everybody hear me? I know that Mark Brannon gave a tribute to Nancy Beck a few weeks ago, but for those of you who weren't here, you may not know that after 11 years as president of the Princeton Adult School, Nancy has decided to step away. I'm not going to say step down, because she's going to continue as curriculum coordinator, thank heavens. She's done a magnificent job leading the adult school for 11 years. She's still going to be very, very actively involved in it, and I hope you will join me in giving her a big thank you. If I say anything more, I'll embarrass her even more. So, I am delighted to introduce one of my colleagues from Rutgers University tonight, Alan Howard, who is a professor of history and vice chair of graduate education at Rutgers University. He teaches and does research in African and Atlantic history. His research focuses geographically on the Upper Guinea Coast area of West Africa and topically on ethnicity, commerce, and urban social life. He has written extensively on the application of spatial analysis to African history. At Rutgers, he is actively engaged in the Black Atlantic Diaspora Major Field and in the Center for African Studies, where he was a member of the executive committee and the program chair from 1999 until 2004. He teaches, in addition to a freshman course in world history, he teaches courses in modern Africa, West Africa, Southern Africa, African cultural history, and a seminar on African cities. So you can see he is absolutely perfect for our topic tonight. Among his many publications are a book called Community Leadership and the Transformation of Freetown, 1801 to 1976, and The Spatial Factor in African History, the relationship of the social, material, and perceptual, as well as many articles and chapters on the slave trade and the transformation of African cities. He's currently working on 2 books, so you can keep an eye out for those. One is called Contested Places, Disputed Rules, Traders and Authorities in Northern Sierra Leone, 1780 to 1930, and a book that examines the social, cultural, and economic histories of Liverpool, Freetown, and Kingston from the 18th century to the present. So please help me welcome Alan Howard.
Try to get this thing hooked up here. What's that? Oh, you want to... That should do it. You okay there? I think that's all. Is that all right? Okay. Well, I'd like to thank Nancy Beck and Barbara Lee for inviting me, and all of you for attending. This is, I know, is a week of religious meeting for many of you, and it's a special week, and so I'm happy to see such a turnout. I hope you're happy with the result. I notice over here we have the sign to silence the cell phones. As you know, teaching in these years, we usually tell people to turn off their computers, but if you have a computer on and you happen to watch the women's NCAA basketball game, you can call out the score anytime you like. So, this is called Freetown in Atlantic History, but I give it a subtitle, The Rise, Fall, and Hoped-for Rebirth of a Remarkable City. It's a city I've lived in quite a number of years and I have a great affection for, but it's a city, as many of you know, that has undergone a great crisis associated with the civil war in Sierra Leone. Freetown has been called the Athens of West Africa because of its many centers of learning, but it's also been called an Atlantic hellhole. Freetown has one of the most naturally beautiful harbors in West Africa, or perhaps anywhere around the Atlantic, backed up against the Leone Mountains. Its streets once were lined with hundreds of houses, mostly frame houses, both quaintly small and magnificently large, built in a truly Atlantic style, incorporating architectural features from around the Atlantic. But nearly half that city was burned out by rampaging rebels in the 1990s. Freetown's docks once overflowed with a wide range of commodities that were bound for London, Marseille, Hamburg, and New York, for that matter. Now its docks are oftentimes nearly empty. Who can explain these kinds of contradictions? What kind of city is Freetown anyway? Freetown is the capital of Sierra Leone. I'll move ahead and just show you a couple other pictures here. Here is the city backed up against the Leone Mountains. Another shot again. And I think one thing I want to point out here is that you can see churches and mosques intermingled, and you see a little bit of that kind of architecture which typified Freetown, but now is being lost. Here we are, Sierra Leone rather, in West Africa, a very small country, a little over 5 million people, about the size of South Carolina, and a close-up shot of Sierra Leone again with Freetown, its main port, and for a long period now its capital. And a map that shows the rivers. Again, you see Freetown on a peninsula reaching out into the Atlantic, and I think you get some sense of the harbor. It's a magnificent harbor, a place that has been used for centuries, and as I'll refer to later, during the Second World War, a place where they brought together large convoys of ships. It was very important in the Allied war effort. And another close-up, and you see the mountains that follow the length of the peninsula behind Freetown, and it's the shape of the mountains that gave the first Portuguese explorers this idea of a lion, and hence the name Sierra Leone. As I said before, Sierra Leone, the size of South Carolina, its population perhaps 5.4 million. There really hasn't been a good census in a long time, and people estimate Freetown's population now at about 786,000, but I think there are probably 1 million or more people because of the war refugees that flocked into the city and then have stayed. In the talk tonight, I'll refer to Freetown as an Atlantic city and explain as I go ahead what I mean by that. Secondly, we'll look at the social and cultural life of Freetown, particularly the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, the period before the war. And then finally, I'll try to give you a few explanations of the recent crisis in Sierra Leone and in maybe many neighboring countries for that matter, and some efforts of the people to restore Freetown and to build new forms of participatory government, which I think we all hope will lead to a rebirth of that city. Freetown in Atlantic history. By that I mean several things. Atlantic City is part of Eurasian and African history in a large sense, and we'll come back to that. Atlantic history includes not only the ocean itself, but the ports on the ocean, but then the regions all around the Atlantic. And we have to look both at then how Freetown is oriented toward the Atlantic, but also oriented inland, and that's a very old feature of its history. We'll also look at the commercial and cultural connections that Freetown has with inland cities and with cities around the Atlantic, including places like Liverpool, as well as the other commercial centers I mentioned earlier. And we'll start out by looking at some of the inland regions. Again, I hope, as I always try to do, teaching African history, to disabuse people of some of the stereotypes that are so deeply ingrained with regard to West Africa and Africa generally, and talk a little bit about the cities, states, and commercial networks that existed before Freetown came into being. As I mentioned before, Freetown is part of an Afro-Eurasian landmass, and this is extremely important, especially as it pertains to the history of Islam. Long before the Europeans arrived on the coast, these trade routes that you see, and these are the major routes, were connecting the coastal areas with all the rest of West Africa, with North Africa, with the Mediterranean, and what we call now the Middle East, and beyond, of course. Sierra Leone, I'm going to try this pointer now. Oh, I guess I turned it on. And, oh, okay, you have to hold it on. Right here is Sierra Leone. You don't see any trade route reaching down to the coast pre-European, but it actually did exist. In fact, this whole coastal area was linked with the interior well before the Europeans arrived. And again, just a brief indication. I took this from a map drawn by my colleague Michael Siegel, who is the chief cartographer at Rutgers and is now up on the website of the Schoenberg Institution in New York, part of the New York Public Library, illustrating some of the many large states and empires in West Africa, and a little bit of the timeline of some of the West African states and empires. Again, Sierra Leone was over here, not a place where any large empires existed in the past, but a place in which, in the period when Freetown was coming into existence, probably about 60 mini-states existed in the nearby surrounding areas. These are what people later called chiefdoms, but they were really tiny kingdoms with their own capitals and political establishment. On the upper Niger River, I think everyone knows the Niger rises at the borders of Sierra Leone and goes all the way through West Africa and comes down to the coast in Nigeria. On the upper Niger in particular, large states centered on cities existed, and they had complex governments, bureaucracies, and armies. I won't talk about that, but this is the famous Sankore Mosque in Timbuktu. And this is a 14th century Catalan map depicting West African cities and states. This was the European, well, sense of what West Africa was like before the slave trade and before racism began to warp the mentality of Europeans. And this person over here is Mansa Musa, the famous king of Mali, who reigned in the early part of the 14th century. And West Africa was in the minds of this, the mind of this Catalan cartographer, but really in the minds of many learned Europeans, associated with cities, with states, with Islam, with commerce, and of course, above all, with gold. And West African gold, as you probably know, really kept much of the European economy afloat at that period of time. Now, as we said, Sierra Leone was not part of any of these large empires, but there were many mini states. And this man, who I actually interviewed because his ancestors were involved in trade and commerce as well as in politics, by means King Inga preserved his family house, which goes back to about the time that Freetown was founded, in the late 1700s, to show young people what these small royal palaces were like. And of course, around that house on both sides were many other houses. It was really an extensive compound. So this is preface to the history of Freetown, just to say that Freetown is built in an area in which there were many states, there were small cities, and in some cases quite large cities further in the interior. There was a lot of commerce, and Islam had already been planted. And that's important to keep in mind. When the British and their allies started Freetown, I'll give you some history of that now, they encountered African states and had to deal with them. And for the first century or so of Freetown's history, it was certainly a situation in which the small British colony, this small enclave, was by no means dominant. So Freetown was one coastal city among many other enclaves in an area that was not controlled by the Europeans. Now, there are other West African states in, say, present-day Nigeria that were not part of the same commercial and political system as the region of Sierra Leone. One that you probably know about was this area, what is now southwestern Nigeria and the Republic of Benin, an area where people speak Yoruba and related languages. There was a very famous kingdom of Benin right here, which produced a lot of fabulous art that's in most museums, the Metropolitan Museum and elsewhere. Here I just picked out a couple of the well-known carvings from the Yoruba-speaking kingdom of Owo, O-W-O, which again predated by a couple hundred years the first arrival of the Europeans on this coastal area down to the east of Sierra Leone. One reason I mention this is to prepare you for some later connections between Freetown and this area of West Africa about 1,000 miles down the coast, which has to do with the history of the slave trade. These are, of course, carved in ivory, and pieces like this were actually, when the Europeans arrived, carved for the Europeans on demand, but it reflects a much larger historical cultural font, if you wish to say, that goes back really 3,000 years before the present. Now, am I going too fast? This is really preface. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll look at the Atlantic slave trade and the founding of Freetown. That'll be the first topic. These are some figures on the Atlantic slave trade based on some very solid research. You see this figure down here. This is the total number of people who are forcibly taken to the Americas in the period from 1650 to about 1900. And many people would push that estimate up to over 12 million. And probably even that 12 million figure should be plus or minus 20%. But actually, historians of Africa are gaining a very accurate demographic picture of the history of the slave trade through studying records in the West African ports, in the European ports, and the American ports. And a lot of this is now available on CD-ROM. You can look up thousands of ships, actually, and learn everything about their cargo, their captains, their port of embarkation and disembarkation, and so on and so forth. It's very, very well studied on a quantitative basis. Of course, what we're also trying to do is to understand all of this in human terms. And there are many new biographies of people who were participating in the slave trade, slavers themselves, but also people who were caught up as victims of the slave trade, and there's a lot of wonderful literature available on that now. But I think it's important to start with the quantitative side. And if you look at this area right here, the Upper Guinea coast, that's the area from around Freetown, the area especially to the north of Freetown. And in a couple of later maps I'll show you, this area is actually called Sierra Leone. The region that contains the pieces of art I showed you before is this area right here, the Bight of Benin. And you can see that there's quite a variation in the areas that supply enslaved Africans to the Atlantic and, of course, to the Americas. When we talk about the slave trade, we always talk about its concentration in time and in place. And that's very important for the history of Freetown, and we'll come back to that. This is a map also created by Mike Siegel, also in the Schoenberg collection, and they have a wonderful website. Just again to illustrate the Sierra Leone area here and the many sources of enslaved Africans. And I chose this particular one just to give you a little indication of the places in the Americas to which people are taken. We won't spend time on this now, but it's also very important to know that many Africans who were enslaved specifically for their skills. And one of the best illustrations of this is people from Sierra Leone and the neighboring areas of Guinea who were oftentimes enslaved for their rice production. This past fall, I was in Savannah, Georgia, and then went to a rice farming plantation that you can still go to well, it's actually on the Georgian coast. And you could see the old outlines of all this kind of production. The only way that these areas in Georgia and South Carolina became world leaders in rice production was by importing the skills of people from around Sierra Leone. So all this precedes Freetown, but it's part of the context of Freetown and is important to know. Now, in the area near where Freetown developed, up that harbor that I drew attention to and you saw on the earlier map, was one of the most notorious of the slaving islands in that area. It's called Bunce Island or Bence Island. And this is a map drawn of it in the later 1700s, a little bit before the time that Freetown was created. I've actually gone there and been on this island. I have some slides of it, but I actually couldn't find them. So they're just somewhere lost for the time being. I hope I can come up with them again. So again, think about this, that Freetown, this site that we'll talk about, this province of freedom, this place to which tens of thousands of liberated Africans were taken, when they first began to operate, their slave trading was going on only a few miles away. So now a little bit of the abolitionist literature. My colleague Christopher Brown just wrote a wonderful book for which he has won a number of prizes called Moral Capital, and he has a totally new take on the abolition movement in Britain, and we'll focus on Britain because Sierra Leone was a British colony and the British led the way in the abolition movement. And many British abolitionists, of course, through their engravings and other use of visual depictions, drew attention to the horrors of the slave trade in the late 18th century. This is a depiction that I'm sure you already have seen many times, referenced the so-called practices of tight packing. British abolitionists also depicted enslaved Africans in the Americas, and people like Cowper wrote poems celebrating resistance of Africans against slavery or the dehumanization of Africans in this process of enslavement. Here you actually see a slave driver of African descent. Like any system of domination, people were co-opted into the system to repress others. Now we'll turn to the history of Freetown. Freetown grows in stages. It starts in 1787. In fact, I was there. I was invited to give a paper at the 200th anniversary of the first founding of Freetown, and this was in 1987. And it began as a place called the province of Freetown, Freedom, and originally was for freed blacks from London. In fact, it was in some ways an effort on the part of at least some to get rid of these people from London. Others had a more humanitarian and positive dimension to their thinking. In any case, this first little province of freedom was started here. That failed and was replaced by the Sierra Leone Company. The Sierra Leone Company existed up until really 1807 when the British formally took it over and created a colony. The Sierra Leone Company was very, very interesting because it embodied the principles of the reformers of those days, the people who created Freetown and places like that. The idea was Christianity and commerce. Right? The British, or at least some British, not all by any means, but a growing number of British, felt a great sense of weight upon them because Britain was the premier slave trading nation. British ships carried somewhere over 4 million of those 10 million plus people across the Atlantic. And this was the sins of our fathers. The sins of our fathers were going to be redeemed by doing positive things. And the most positive thing, of course, was to introduce Africans to Christianity and also to commerce. Christianity and commerce, of course, was the formula for civilizing Africans. You know, the assumption is that they needed civilization. But there was also another dimension to that. Part of it was that the British felt responsibility for destroying existing African civilizations. So this was a kind of redemptive act. And you can see the downtown of Freetown was laid out on this grid. It's actually, what occurs there is a massive social science experiment, an effort to change people totally, right? To replace their existing cultures with a different set of cultural practices. And that's very central to the whole history of Freetown and neighboring areas. Now, actually, the first people who are taken there and who go there after those Africans brought from London were Nova Scotians. And many of these Nova Scotians wound up in Canada, but they came from places like New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, and so on. They were the so-called Black Loyalists, and I'm sure some of you have read, there are a number of interesting books on the Black Loyalists. They fought on the British side, in other words, the losing side in our War of Independence. And around 1775, the governor of Virginia realized that the British forces were not numerous enough to hold off the American rebels, so they began to recruit enslaved Africans. And they offered them liberty if they joined the British cause. People joined in large numbers, tens of thousands actually. About 10% of them were already free black people, but the majority were enslaved people. And by doing that, they received a certificate of manumission and became free people. I think the first to go to Canada were people in 1776 who went from Massachusetts. The last were from New York in 1783. So they wind up in Nova Scotia and become the Nova Scotians. Now there's a lot of interesting stories that we could tell you about that, but I won't go into the details. But a number of important leaders of this Nova Scotian group who had some importance in the history of the US, but importance in the history of Canada, but ultimately importance for the history of Sierra Leone, persuaded the British that they would be better off going back to Africa. So in 1792, 15 ships went from Nova Scotia, from Halifax actually, to the port of Freetown, carrying back these Nova Scotians. And then they were ensconced in this town of Freetown. Another important group were the Jamaican Maroons. And probably most of you know something about the history of slavery in Jamaica and other islands like this. Slavery was always resisted. And one way of resisting, of course, was for enslaved people to escape into the backlands and create Maroon communities. The Maroons were notorious for their fighting capacity. They would raid down onto the plantations and free people. And a number of these Maroon communities created states, particularly in Jamaica, in the backlands, in the hills, and in the forested areas, and continually fought the British government and the holders of the slaves on the plantations. Although ultimately a number of truces were reached, treaties were signed, and in fact, ultimately some of these maroon communities, which were in a sense beacons of hope for enslaved people, gave up that kind of role and signed treaties with the British, and part of the treaties were typically called for returning of enslaved people to the plantation owners. So that beacon of hope was snuffed out. Nonetheless, the British kept fighting these people, and in the late 18th century, a major truce was reached, and I think 1,100 or so, no, about 600 or so people went back to Sierra Leone. That was part of the deal from Jamaica to Sierra Leone. This actually is a statue in Haiti to self-liberated people, to Maroons. Now, in Freetown, then you have the people from London, the Nova Scotians, and the Jamaican Maroons settling around this silk cotton tree, which is many hundreds of years old. I took this slide in the 1960s, and you see the size of the car here compared to this tree. All right. Now, what you have to imagine, and there's no longer really any remnants of this, but 2 blocks from this tree on the shore was what was called the Liberated African Yard. And there's just a little wrought iron gate left there. But this Liberated African Yard is where somewhere between 80,000 and 130,000, the numbers are not clear, but at least 80,000 people were liberated by the British Navy and some allies who eventually worked with them, and freed in Freetown. And they joined those first 3 groups that were taken there. And so people 2 blocks from this tree had their chains cut, right? And oftentimes they were almost immediately renamed John instead of Tamba, or whatever it might be, right? Mary instead of whatever name they might have had before. But this tree then becomes a symbol of liberty, right? Because it's what people saw towering above this liberated African yard. And this tree is in the center of Freetown and has always been a center of actually spiritual meaning for people as well as political meaning. Now, this is an early sketch of Freetown, and this is one of those streets you saw on that grid. Most of the people liberated off the slave ships were taken to these villages in the mountains in the hinterland of Sierra Leone, and it's there that they were, in a sense, subjected to the social science experiment. This is one of the villages. I took this slide from up on the top. This is a village known as Charlotte. Most of them were named, these villages were named after the British royal family, or after major events in British history, or after great generals. So we have one called Wellington, another called Hastings, and you get the picture, right? So this was Charlotte. And of course, the main institutions were the church and the school. The school is down here, but it's not much left of it. People, of course, one interesting thing is that the same things were being done in Britain at this period of time. The British middle class was trying to civilize the British working class in the cities, you know, people who lived in squalor and people who were totally uneducated, right? So there was missionizing activities in West Africa at the same time there were missionizing activities in all the great industrial cities. Again, an effort on both parts to civilize these people who needed to be taught proper ways of life. And just like the British children of the working class were being subjected to schools with rows like this, order, you know, so was that true in the school here. The church bell regulated people's lives. Most enslaved people, of course, were in their teens and in their 20s, and these were people that were considered by the missionaries and the administrators malleable, right? You would rework them and make them into good, civilized folk. In some ways, this experiment actually worked quite well. Now here's the cathedral in downtown Freetown, and then one of the small Anglican churches. The major missionary institution was the Church Missionary Society of the Anglican Church, right? And these churches are all over the Sierra Leone Peninsula, and a lot of them go back to the early 1800s. They're quite important historic places. I said the experiment worked in a number of ways. About 90% of the people liberated off the slave ships do become Christians in one way or another, right? One way or another. Some become very Orthodox Christians. Most people blend Christianity with the indigenous faiths they brought with them. The largest number of people liberated off the slave ships were people speaking Yoruba and related languages, coming from what is now southwestern Nigeria. And it's very clear, there's just a lot of records, written records, oral records, physical records, to show that people blended together Christianity with indigenous Yoruba beliefs. Now, Orthodox missionaries and some of the most Orthodox of these liberated people tried to repress this, but they oftentimes didn't, well, they just didn't succeed, period. I've been at many ceremonies in Freetown and other parts of the Sierra Leone Peninsula in which people would call ancestors, celebrate a Yoruba-like naming ceremony immediately after coming from church where the child was baptized. They would go right home and have an African naming ceremony. Many different ways people blend together African beliefs and practices with Christian beliefs and practices. This is a divination plate and a divination wrapper, a knocker, used to call Ifa an intermediary in divination processes. This is a cemetery up in one of the little villages that we mentioned before, but it's built next to a silk cotton tree where spirits reside. So in that ceremony, in the cemetery, I should say, there would be Christian ceremonies of burial held and then African ceremonies of burial held side by side. Now, this experiment worked in a number of other ways. For one thing, it led to a very significant number of highly educated Africans, the people taken off these slave ships or their descendants. So in Freetown, in the 19th century, the level of education was higher than in Britain. Now, people think, how could that ever be? But it's certainly true, and it can be, I think, demonstrated in a number of ways. The level of literacy was higher, and the general achievement of, if you want to call advanced education, professional status, and so on, was very high. There were many Sierra Leonean lawyers, doctors, ministers of religion, professional administrators, et cetera, coming out of these missionary schools. But of course, very quickly, the Africans in Freetown and other places up and down the coast created their own educational institutions separate from the missionary institutions. This is Forbay College. I actually taught in Forbay College, not this building, but a newer version of it. This was the first college in West Africa of the kind of Western style, built in 1827. You can see how early that was. And many people who were educated here then went to places like Durham, University of Durham, or other universities in Britain for further higher studies. The most famous of these people, perhaps, was Bishop Samuel Crowther, who became the bishop of the missionary area in Nigeria, a very large area, and himself a Yoruba speaker, right? Enslaved as a child, acquired a great deal of education, then became a bishop who actually had many white people below his administration. In the end of the 19th century, as pseudoscientific racism takes hold, there was a virulent campaign against Crowther to push him out because the whites of that period of time really did not want to have Africans in such a position of authority, and they campaigned against him. Some of the more important schools in Freetown, the Albert Academy, the Church Missionary Grammar School, these schools have turned out hundreds and hundreds of highly educated people. You see, that's not a very good slide, is it, when you project it? But this is a graduating class from the Albert Academy in the later 19th century. Of course, there's old boy networks. People were all dressed in a certain, they had their ties, they had their symbols. It's like a very good British private school. Now, we said this is an Atlantic city. Well, you can already see the connections with Britain. You can see the connections with Jamaica and the Maroons. You can see the connections with Nova Scotia and so on. But these are not lost. These continue on throughout the 19th century. And some of the most famous people from the Caribbean who came to Sierra Leone came as administrators. Some were acting governors, chief lawyers in the colony, and so on. So there was a continuous remigration. And actually, this man Blyden's great-granddaughter, who is a friend of mine that teaches at Georgetown, has written a book on the people from the West Indies who go back to Sierra Leone as administrators, as newspaper editors and publishers, et cetera, et cetera. Her great-grandfather was probably the most famous of these people, Edward W. Blyden, who authored numerous books and worked first of all for the Liberian administration and later for the Sierra Leone administration. We could say more about him. It's not only men, there were many highly educated women at that period of time, some of whom ran their own schools, and this continued on into the 20th century. I could give you a lot of biographies. Women also were quite prominent in the 19th and early 20th century as market women. And in the 19th century, African and European merchants really competed with one another. The Europeans were by no means dominant. There were, up and down the West African coast, plenty of African millionaires in our terms. They didn't necessarily have £1 million then, but they had what is equivalent to that, and owned their own buildings. They had hundreds of employees, et cetera, et cetera. In some sectors, Africans dominated. Now, again, this is before the conquest of the interior. Everything I'm talking about is before the conquest of the interior. Now, what happens, you see, as Freetown gets linked up with this large trading region. This is actually from an article I read. Sorry, I don't mean to be autobiographical here, but an article I did a while back showing the integration of these regions. And the numerous highways in this area developed into 3 large corridors that linked Freetown with the interior and with some of these large states we mentioned before. Of course, all this road building was not done by the British. The road building was done by Africans, right, who organized this commerce. Europeans did not go into the interior here except occasional explorers. So people speaking the Mande languages and the Fula languages, Pura languages, who are famed as long-distance traders who had integrated most of West Africa, came to Freetown and settled there and established commercial communities, schools, mosques, and so on and so forth. That's the 19th century history. Very quick overview. But you can see it's a polyglot place. It has people from all over West Africa, all over West Central Africa, some even from East Africa, brought through the slave trade. Right? It has these people from the interior who migrate to Freetown and transform it into an African city and linked with the interior. Okay, the 20th century, though, means things change very radically. The 20th century, Freetown becomes an imperial capital of a colony. Instead of an enclave dealing on in a bargain way, on a basis of equality, or even less than equal with the African political and economic figures in the interior, now Freetown becomes the capital for an imperializing Britain. The British and the French conquer the interior in this area. The British establish an administrative hierarchy with the British governor residing in Freetown at the top of this hierarchy. We'll say a bit more of that as we go ahead. Freetown now comes to rule over the hinterland. And there's an establishment also of a commercial hierarchy with Freetown as the dominant port, something that, again, did not exist in the past. Major state builders, heads of large Muslim states actually larger than the colony of Sierra Leone as it developed. Men like this man, Samri Touré, were hunted down and captured. Here's a picture of him. He was captured by the French, I think in 1903. He was taken into exile, I believe in Mauritius. They wanted to get him out of the way because he was very well known as a political organizer. He built a very complexly organized state, a large commercial network in about 30 years, and resisted the French more effectively than anyone else in all of West Africa. But he was conquered like everyone else was conquered. Sierra Leone then develops a colony. I'm sorry, this map is not very good, but the borders of the colony are around here, right like this. You can see it. Can you see that dashed line? Okay, so something that was once a wholly integrated commercial network is now broken up into several colonies. So there's a French colony up here. There's the newly created Liberia, which is expanding. You know, Liberia was also an imperialist country. And then there's the British right here. And you can notice the British built a railroad from the border to Freetown, right? But it doesn't cross over into Liberia. The railroad doesn't cross over into the French territories. In other words, they're creating, again, a sealed off. The money here is different than the money there, whereas once it was a unified commercial monetary system, there were African monies that existed. People who had moved back and forth now have to pay customs duties at the border. The legal systems are different. People in the once large commercial system now are in 4 different legal systems, and so on and so forth. Colonialization is highly fragmentary, and Sierra Leone illustrates that very well. Freetown then, 1898, becomes, as I said, a colonial capital, and here's the governor, you know, they're dressed in white with these pith helmets, reviewing. These are African rulers who are now called chiefs and who get built into the administrative hierarchy. They collect taxes for the British. They round up forced labor for the British. Chiefs are corrupted by this practice. And here again you see the British, of course, recruit a police force, and here's 2 white men on the left and white men on the right, and these people are there to administer and enforce the law. Again, there's always systems of cooptation and rule through Africans. Sorry, this slide, again, some of these look to me better when they're up close than when they're projected. But what you see here is a rather notorious place called Hill Station for whites only. In the past, actually, Africans and Europeans lived more or less side by side, and you saw their businesses were often side by side, and there was a lot of intermarriage and so on. After the imperial conquest and under the impact of pseudoscientific racism, segregation really takes hold in Freetown and most of these other coastal enclaves, and the whites supposedly for health, you know, to avoid malaria, to avoid yellow fever, you get up on the hills where there's breeze, and there's some very elaborate little cabins built for the European administrators. They also built a cog wheel railroad, very unusual rail that would climb up this steep mountain, and every day the European administrators would go down to the administrative buildings. They're all men, by the way, and the males would climb up this cog rail to the more salubrious environment. Also created people like this court messenger, again, who assisted them in their administrative activities. As I said before, Freetown becomes a port now in a dendritic system. You think of that rail, you know what dendrites are. Everything was now designed, instead of integrating a number of different ecological zones into a large regional system, the rail now is designed to drain commodities to the port, right? And then to Britain or wherever else, especially to Britain. And you see here, in the early part of the 20th century, the main product of Sierra Leone was palm, of course, palm olive soap, palm for margarine, palm oil for cooking, many, many other uses. In fact, before petroleum oil, palm oil was used in a lot of the lubrication in the large factories that existed in Lancaster and places like that in Britain. Then this palm fruit from all over the colony was taken on these, this is a narrow gauge railroad, and then down to the port, put in these lighter boats, and then taken out to the large ships. In the early part of the 20th century, the economy was still very diverse. It might be hard to read this, but there were 8 or 10 different agricultural commodities being exported. There were no mineral exports yet. Later on, however, the diamond industry develops over here. This is really taking hold by the 1950s. There's an iron industry up here at this place, Lunsar. I lived very near there for about 9 months. That takes hold in the 1930s. Eventually rutile and other minerals are extracted nearer to the coast here. And gradually, the economy I didn't type this incorrectly. It should say, by the 1950s, the mineral economy began to dominate. It's a little backwards, sorry. By the 1970s, primary product prices fall. And this has harmed all of Africa. All of Africa was impoverished by the falling prices for copper, for iron, and for all these agricultural commodities. Diamonds, of course, are an exception to this. So this Lunsar mine closes up. Copper mines in Central Africa close up. It leads to a massive impoverishment and a reduction of the working class, like in the United States. Good jobs go out. Widespread rural impoverishment occurs during the colonial era. And this is a critical thing. diamond mining becomes a great attraction. So by the 1950s already, when I first went to Sierra Leone in the 1960s, during each diamond mining season, there would be 110, 120,000 young men who would go to the diamond fields in hopes of getting rich because they couldn't really survive any longer in the countryside farming. Prices for commodities were just too low. So a once highly integrated regional economy gets truncated. A once diversified economy becomes dependent on a few minerals. The prices for agricultural crops fall. There's a massive rural impoverishment. Well, this is critical to understanding why there's a civil war in Sierra Leone, why Freetown, half of it's burned down, why there's a rebel group called the Revolutionary United Front. So this is at the center of it. Without understanding the rural impoverishment, you can't understand why youth are drawn into. Okay, in the 20th century, European firms come to dominate. They push African merchants down the economic ladder. That's also very important. There's an undercutting of the African middle class in many ways in Sierra Leone, especially that independent middle class that was based on commerce. There's still, though, a professional or administrative middle class. So holding on to the government becomes a critical thing because the government supplies most of the jobs, the good jobs. So people are going to fight over who controls the government. I should remind everyone that African soldiers were very, very important in both the First World War and the Second World War. They suffered serious casualties in Europe. But I'm really raising this up for another reason. Colonialism always has its own contradictions built in, right? I mean, you educate all these people, and then you say, well, you have to be subject to our domination. That is not going to last very long, right? You train people as soldiers, and you tell them that they're going to fight against the fascists for liberty. But are only white people supposed to be free? That's a contradiction, right? So colonialism has many contradictions built into it. You can see here it says, can you read that? Carry on, Dad, and we'll have liberty. Oh, we love liberty, I'm sorry, and we hate oppression. But of course, these little children are living under oppressive conditions. So this is a serious contradiction. And I can't remember again what the mother says, but she says, well, let's all hope Dad soon comes home. Something to that effect, right? This is British propaganda for the war effort, but there's a double message there, obviously. Now, in the later 1930s, and in the Second World War, and in the period immediately after the Second World War, there's a great deal of radicalism in Sierra Leone, in Freetown in particular, and other coastal cities up and down the West African coast. One of the premier figures in this is a man named I.T.A. Wallace Johnson, who was a socialist, a Pan-Africanist, and who scared the British a great deal because he wanted to unify these various colonies. And he's not the first one to think of this. Blyden thought of it. There are other Pan-Africanists going way back into the 19th century. But there's a new burst of Pan-Africanism and radical labor organizing activities, anti-colonial activities in the 1930s during the Depression, obviously, right? The Depression is affecting West Africa just like it affects the United States and Britain. And this is a statue in downtown Freetown to Wallace Johnson. Another person who is an important Pan-Africanist in this period of time was Constance Cummings John, who I actually knew fairly well, or I knew her to some degree. One of my good friends wrote an autobiography of her based on Constance records. She was a leader in the West African Youth League and in the West African Student Union. She went to school in the United States where she encountered a great deal of racism. She then went to Britain, was an organizer of these Pan-Africanist movements, but she was also an early feminist, quite a strong feminist. So Wallace Johnson, Constance Cummings John, and so on are putting the pressure on the British in the 1930s, the 1940s, early 1950s, feminist, Pan-Africanist, internationalist, socialist in their thinking. Well, Wallace Johnson they put in jail for the whole of the Second World War, but you can see Freetown is a place of political ferment in this period of time. And people have strong connections with people of color throughout the Atlantic. Right? London had been a hotbed. Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, Nnamdi Azikiwe, the first president of Nigeria, and so on. They were all friends of Constance Cummings John. They all met in London. This is a truck. This truck traveled all over Sierra Leone. They would carry commodities down from the interior to Freetown. I took this slide maybe 4 or 5 years after Sierra Leone became independent. And you see this large African figure astride the continent, right? His chains broken. Now, this doesn't refer to the chains of slavery, but the chains of colonialism. And you see this sort of puny European with his pith helmet, like that governor, being cast out of the continent. This is the effort to achieve national independence, right? And this truck driver hired some artist to put this on the side of his door. This is his message that he was carrying up and down these roads. And of course, the contradictions are manifest. It's obvious where this motto comes from. Right? What's missing? Fraternity, right? Fraternity. No fraternity with the Europeans, although a fraternity for Africans at this period of time. But the truth is that the big questions were not answered. I mean, African countries become independent, but the real questions are not answered, right? What kind of government should there be? How should we redistribute wealth? What are we going to do about all those poor people, et cetera, et cetera? These questions are not answered by the achievement of independence. And of course, the contradictions continue on, especially in these capital cities. So now we're going to just look at Freetown very quickly in this period of the 60s to the 90s. Am I taking too much time? About 5 more minutes? Okay. Maybe we'll skip the wind-up then. I'll just go through these pictures very fast. Okay, here's I won't read them. You can see, again, market women, a mom-and-pop shop, ice cream vendors. This is after the end of the 40 days of fast during Ramadan. There's prayer the same day. People coming together of different ethnic backgrounds. Just market women, again, leaving the market, abandoning the market for prayer. I was going to play, the music you heard before was the music of people like this, musicians coming, you know, they're building on a musical tradition that's 700 years old, going back to ancient Mali, and they're performing in Freetown. There's a bride arriving with members of her bridal party, but they all belong to a women's association, right, dressed the same, and here's the women preparing for the wedding feast. I took all these in Freetown. Here again, ethnicity is not bad necessarily, right? Here's the Fulla headman, preceded by his musicians. There were about this day when I took these slides, there were about 7,000 Fulla going to the headman's house, all to be fed. The headman ran his own court. The headman settled, and the head women settled all the disputes among the ethnic members. It's only when ethnicity is politicized does it become a bad thing, right? What we call tribalization of ethnicity. Okay, so I'll go through this very, very fast. This man was the first prime minister. He was a medical doctor. But he and his party, the Sierra Leone People's Party, the Party of Independence, really began to politicize ethnicity, favoring people of his language group, the Mende, over others. Here you see another official, Kandiburi, speaking at a Muslim gathering, but politicizing that gathering. He became the Minister of Education. He was once the ambassador to the UN. Here you see a women's ethnic association being on national television. So it becomes, again, ethnicity becomes politicized. This man, who was the third prime minister and then the first president, became extremely corrupt. President Shaka Stevens, he embezzled hundreds of millions of dollars. He was involved in very corrupt diamond trading, known for his very repressive regimes. He killed a good friend of mine. The class order strengthens even. Here are people living in poverty at the bottom of the stream. Up at the top are people who are government officials living in very fancy houses. Now, what happens to the youth? Of course, many go to the diamond fields. Trouble is, of course, diamond mining becomes integrated with the arms traffic. You have all heard about conflict diamonds or blood diamonds. There have been some popular movies about this in recent days, which the Sierra Leoneans don't like the recent movie, by the way, because they think it depicts Sierra Leone in a negative way. But the local diamond dealer is tied with the Antwerp trade. I'm not saying this is all illegitimate, but a lot of it was. There's a child soldier of the Revolutionary United Front. These are the people that took over and destroyed half of Freetown, young people like this. And here's just a couple of slides. I don't want to dwell on this, but this is the market, which tens of thousands of people attended every week, burned to the ground. And of course, order restored by a combination of the UN forces, the British forces, and West African forces. And these West African fighters, growing out of a much older military mode, were very important. No, just 2 more minutes then. Efforts to rebuild Freetown, I think they've been going on. I was going to say more about this, but I took too long on the preface. I think the critical thing here is that women are fully engaged in this process of rebuilding. Women were critically important for blocking the RUF. They oftentimes stood up against the military of the government, and there's some major figures we could talk about. Popular protests against these rebels. We always hear about the rebels. We hear about the limbs being hacked off, but we don't hear about those people who stood up against them, and there were thousands who did that. Youth, not recruited with submachine guns, but youth who stood up against them for democratic politics. Again, truck drivers who put these kind of signs on their trucks, bus drivers who stood up against the rebels, and people, again, building a popular movement for democracy. And you can see this is going on in Freetown now. People, again, fully committed to democracy, standing in these long lines to vote, but then it's only 3 years after this that the town was invaded. Women, again, were among the primary organizers. I was going to talk about a woman, Zainab Bangura, but we'll skip that. Here you see the ballot for the 2002 election, which restored government. Now, the big questions still remain. Here's President Kaba, who is sworn in by the Chief Justice. You know, it's the British Whig. This is 2002. Here he's got his hand on the Bible and the Quran. Both, I think, he's swearing the oath to uphold the Republic of Sierra Leone. Will he also drop into corruption, or will the people, I think, who really matter, especially the people of Freetown, hold him to be accountable? And we'll wrap it up. Here's the same cotton tree celebrating the bicentenary, 1787 to 1907. I mean, 1987. But of course, the 200th anniversary of the end of the slave trade is now 1807, 2007. So it's 200 years after the abolition of the slave trade. This was 200 years after the founding of Freetown. And here's that cotton tree used as the symbol for a reborn Freetown. And let's hope. So will people look back at the history of struggle for freedom, or will they again be crushed down? I think the diamond trade has been at the heart of this destruction of the city. And this, of course, is why there were these campaigns against blood diamonds. So we're all in some way embroiled with the history of Freetown. Thank you very much. I'm sorry to have gone over my 45 minutes. So I apologize. Sure, I'll be happy to. Yes, please.
Yes. As you know, there's a book about the boy soldier on the bestseller list
Yes.
in Washington, and he's signed up for a second book, and now being made into a movie.
Yes.
Two things. First, what's your impression of this book? Apparently, made the point that he had no choice when he saw his whole family killed.
Yes.
He had to kill or be killed, he had no choice. And he was 13 at the time, and now he's 26.
Yes.
So I'd like you to know, if you don't mind talking a little bit about that book, and also tell us a little about what he terms the rebels, and why did these rebels become so violent?
Yes.
And in fact, he saw his whole family murdered by the rebels. What was it about, and what was the outcome? Could you tell us a little bit about what you call the Civil War, but
Yes.
he calls the rebels?
The Rebel War.
Address both these points for us, please.
I'd be happy to. I haven't actually read that book, but I did see him interviewed on ESPN, I think, a couple nights ago, or C-SPAN. Yeah, about 2 nights ago. So I have a little sense of him. I want to read the book, but just haven't read it yet. It's true. Most youth were impressed into service under the RUF, the Revolutionary United Front. In other words, these young people who carried around heavy weapons and who did commit these atrocities were impressed into service for the most part. And they were treated with a combination of drugs, marijuana, cocaine, etc., and Rambo movies, and they were brainwashed. There's clear brainwashing that went on there, and it's happened with child soldiers in many other parts of the world. But some actually also voluntarily joined, so it becomes a very complex issue. And there are a lot of biographies of these kinds of people. Some of my Sierra Leone colleagues have interviewed a lot of these youth. I know people who worked in the refugee camps. It's not a simple picture. It's a very complex picture. But I think underlying it is, first of all, what I mentioned before, poverty in the rural areas, a lack of hope in the rural areas. The fact that someone like Fodo Sanku, whose picture I didn't show, who is the head of this RUF, could appeal to people ranging from college-educated intellectuals who some of them went to Fort Bay College, down to illiterate rural people with a campaign of overthrowing the dominant structure, right? This was his campaign. There was a certain idealistic dimension to it, but it turned into a murderous thing. Now, I think underlying all of that, however, is the international trade in rare commodities for weapons, diamonds above all, but it's not only diamonds. A lot of the Sierra Leone diamond did not go out through Sierra Leone, but went out through Liberia, where there was a warlord in charge, Charles Taylor, who now is being charged with and tried in international court for crimes against humanity. Charles Taylor was dealing in diamonds, but he was also dealing in timber from Liberia. These are power-grabbing people who headed the RUF, who headed the Liberian armed groups, and who actually became the president of Liberia for a period of time. It's power. It's power combined with wealth. And these people generate wealth that goes on to the international networks of commerce. For that, in return, they get weapons and other commodities. They distribute those commodities to young men in particular. Of course, these young men oftentimes committed a wide variety of crimes, rape. They enslaved young women, used them as sex slaves. It was a very horrendous thing. But I think it has to be seen in this larger Atlantic circuit of, so, you know, if we want to intervene, we would stop buying diamonds, we would work to stop the arms trade, right? Because this will happen somewhere else, because the conditions are ripe for it to happen other places. It's happened in Uganda, it's happened in the Congo, it's happened in Liberia and Sierra Leone, and so on. So it's not just a local thing. Everywhere it happens, there's the same international set of networks and the same recruitment of youth. So his biography is very, very interesting because he was he went through therapy, he was in a sense redeemed, and he's obviously a very, very intelligent guy. You can see the way he talks, right? He's highly educated. Now he wants to be a lawyer. He wants to use his law training to go back and do something to, again, kind of redeem. He admits straightforwardly he killed people, right? He committed these crimes, these atrocious crimes, and he wants to compensate for that and use his skills and education in the U.S. to help to rebuild. So I give him a lot of credit for that. But he could be put on trial, I suppose, except for his youth. That's where he escapes, but the higher-ups are being put on trial.
What's the diet like
in Sierra Leone?
And can they feed themselves?
I think potentially they certainly can, yes. The agricultural potentialities of the country are really quite good. And once it was totally self-sufficient in foodstuffs. I mean, the main crop, again, starchy staple is rice. But then people grow a variety of yams and other sweet potatoes, other starchy manioc, et cetera, and they usually combine it, as you saw in that one pot, with various stews made out of palm oil and tomatoes and various leaves, a lot of leaves. So it's actually quite a rich diet, and when people have some money, then they add fish and beef and chicken and so on to that stew. So the basic diet, if the countryside is functioning well, is actually quite nutritious. So first of all, people need peace, and then they need better prices for agricultural commodities that I would say they also need a new integration, a renewed integration. So there was an effort to form what was called the Mono River Union to link Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, the three neighboring countries. And for a while that was actually quite successful. Custom barriers were falling, the older patterns of trade were being restored, which would allow for a more balanced diet because of a greater exchange of the inland areas with the coastal wet areas with the dry areas and so on. But that broke down during these wars, and it's only gradually is this regional unity being restored. So that would be critical to sustaining people's life.
Why did the mineral prices in the 70s go down?
Yeah, they went down because of probably overproduction and declining demand for iron, for example. That Lensar mine was an extremely fine iron mine. To get to quite pure iron, they had a series of filtrations, and they just washed it with water. And what came out at the bottom after going on a series of tanks was pretty good. I think hematite. I don't know the chemistry that well. But the mine just played out. They just sort of took all the best iron out, and then they just closed it down. Although it was still productive, it wasn't productive enough it's like what happens in many of these places. The profit level was not high enough, so they closed it down. Led to the loss of tens of thousands of jobs, including all those who were satellite to it. So I think it was competition among many producers. It's the same thing that drove down palm prices. I mean, palm oil or all the various substitutes for palm oil were being produced in many West African countries, in Southeast Asia, and elsewhere. The same with cocoa. There's no OPEC of palm oil, right? So there's no way to, they tried to create various producers cartels and never succeeded with any of these commodities. So many countries producing the same thing. Again, the need for regional unity, for an integrated economy in which competitions like this would be reduced is what I would say.
I'd always thought that some of the other European colonial powers, specifically France and Portugal and Belgium, had done a much worse job in their colonies in Africa than the British. But the story that you tell us tonight does not paint a pretty story at all for Britain. Can you rank order those countries or say that they all did a terrible job?
No, I think you're right. You've pointed to something that's quite true. In fact, the British did have a milder colonialism, but it's all relative. I mean, the British, in the early stages of colonization, again, they had used a lot of forced labor. I interviewed a lot of old people, actually people who lived through the whole colonial period, who told about being forced to stand like this and look at the sun until they paid their taxes. Every colony was abusive, but you're right, the British were probably more moderate, and they certainly changed over time. I mean, we have to recognize this. Colonialism changed over time. They put a felt glove over their fist, right, and began to use more moderate methods. Instead of direct extraction of resources and taxes and so on, they began to use import-export taxes, for example, hide the tax, like so often happens. The reason we can see it is somewhat milder than the French, for example, who had the neighboring colony of Guinea, is that everywhere in West Africa, Africans leave the French colonies and go into the British colonies because the taxation levels and the amount of coercion is lower. And the British begin their reforms earlier. French still practice corvée after the Second World War. I think it's abolished in 1946. That's forced labor until right after the Second World War. So there's a migration from French colonies into British colonies throughout the 20th century, well, during the colonial period, which would support your thesis, and I think it's probably true. The worst were the Germans and the Portuguese. And the Portuguese probably worst of all because, again, Portugal was the poorest country. They had to resort to more direct extraction. I think you can differentiate them. You would differentiate them in terms of level of taxation, the amount of forced labor, things like that. There's just notorious, absolutely deadly and notorious schemes carried out in the Belgian Congo and other places around cotton production and so on. Mark Twain was the first person to draw attention to this. Mark Twain wrote this famous book, and this is the first time that these atrocities that we see here in the 1990s were documented, but it was the Belgians cutting off the hands of people in the Congo who didn't deliver enough cotton or other commodities. And that's very well documented. A lot of people have written about this. And, this actually led to the loss of King Leopold, who once had the Congo as his private fief. The scandal was so notorious and so internationally documented by people like Mark Twain that they had to actually take this, the Belgian parliament, if I remember correctly, had to take the Congo away from Leopold and establish it as a more formal colony, but it didn't end all the abuses there by any means. So yeah, I think it's relative degrees of coercion and extraction and oppression, but no colony, you wouldn't want to live in any of these colonies. And I think the colonial heritage is really the critical thing here in explaining a lot of the crises of the 1990s. People do not break. I mean, these abusive African dictators really are taking over from governors who themselves were dictators, right? And they're stepping in, taking hold of the police and the military and using it now for their own ends. So the need to escape the colonial legacy and the international trafficking in these commodities and so on, this is what has not yet been fully resolved, I would say. So you have to look at African failures, but actually the longer legacy of colonialism. These two things explain a lot. Do you think you have to? Okay.
Should we thank Alan?
Well, thank you.